Hello and welcome to this session of Heart.Soul.Mind at St. Paul Lutheran Church this fall of 2020 as we are studying Glenn R. Paauw's book, Saving the Bible from Ourselves. And in this session, looking at his chapter 8, Rediscovering the Storiented Bible. Well, in this chapter, we come finally to Paauw's big story of the Bible, as he calls it, on pages 110 and 111. And what a story that is that he tells. On the handout that accompanies this session, I have tried to outline, as I understand it, what he says on pages 111 to 116, where he gives us this big story of the Bible. He says it starts with creation, rebellion happens quite early, and everything else in the Bible is God's response to that rebellion, the plan, the struggle, and finally the saving restoration. Israel becomes the response to that rebellion, God's response to choose Israel as the vehicle of God's intervention in rebellious creation. And then he goes through the segments of the Jewish Bible with its checkered history, with the prophets as a kind of divine commentary on that history, and finally with the writings to add color and texture and to keep it honest, lest we think that all of this happens in some otherworldly plane outside our world. He turns to the New Testament, still as part of this continuous story of Israel as God's response to the rebellion. And he identifies the arrival of King Jesus, announced in the four Gospels, as the new agent, and then says the rest of the New Testament is about the implications of Jesus coming. Paul and his bridging role between Judaism and Christianity gets significant notice, as he should. And Paauw says that Paul shows Israel's true vocation in the way that he promotes and preaches King Jesus. And then how this all looks in the world and what it takes to make Jesus' kingship real in the world. That's his big story, and I would lift up four key features of it. Again, I've put these on the handout. First one is this general dynamic of creation, disorder, and repair. Secondly, the centrality of Israel in this whole story. Third, Paauw's claim that the Bible is a story of what he calls increasingly focused covenants, moving from the universal to the more specific, and ultimately with the objective of returning to the universal. We'll explore that in more depth in this session. And then finally, that it's all centered in Jesus. That's how he really ends the chapter, talking about the fact that all of this centers in Jesus. Now, he grants that there are 7 lenses, he calls them, through which one might look at the depth and the continuity or the comprehensiveness of the Bible story. And he lists those 7 as possibilities, that this might be a temple story, it might be a liberation story, it might be a forgiveness story, it might be a rebellion and reclamation story, it might be a creation story, it might be a story about recovering the image of God in which humanity was created, it might be a story about order overcoming chaos. So he grants that there are 7 lenses through which one might summarize this story perhaps, or characterize the story, and yet he says even all 7 of these include a core set of common elements, which are creation, loss, Jesus, and the implications of Jesus coming. Something very interesting about that. He's previously said that anybody who tries to tell the story of the Bible without Israel is missing the central point, is missing the core vehicle through which God attempts to redress the problem of human rebellion. And yet in his four common elements of his story, we don't hear Israel. We hear creation, loss, Jesus, and implications. That strikes me as odd. And yet, it's not inconsistent with what else Paauw does in this chapter, because he is, unfortunately, I would say, pretty clearly supersessionist in his engagement with Israel. We can see this on pages 114, 117, 119, 121, places where Paauw consistently says that Israel has its place up until Jesus. But then once Jesus comes, there's no place for Israel anymore in Scripture. So, for example, on 114, he says that the New Testament brings the story to its climax. Well, that means there can be no Israel after the New Testament, unless it's an Israel that is in Christ. On 117, he goes through the bullet points at the top of the page about a canonical survey of the major book groups, and identifies in his big story in the fourth bullet, rooted in the historical journey of Israel. But then in the fifth bullet, Israel disappears into Jesus, as the Bible has a redemptive and saving goal in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, Israel's Messiah and the world's true Lord. Turning again another page to 119, the Bible is a progressive revelation where more and more light shines as the story moves forward toward Jesus. And finally, on 121, in the last sentence of the chapter, he says, if we fail to read the Bible as this Christ story, we fail the Bible completely. I don't want to argue with Paauw's centrality of Jesus, of Christ, in his Christian reading of the Bible, except that the Apostle Paul himself leaves room, even in his Christian proclamation, for Israel, the Jews, the Torah Jews of his day, still to be beloved of God and to have their own future. Side by side, a church which is made up of both Jews and Gentiles. This is called supersessionism, when Jesus or the church simply takes the place of Israel in God's story. That's one of the reasons it's also called replacement theology. But that replacement theology doesn't do justice to the fact that this Bible in our Old Testament is also the Jewish Bible and has to be read differently by the Jewish people with a future for themselves in relationship to God. That is also a legitimate reading that does justice to this Bible, at least the Jewish Bible part of our Christian Bible, and that therefore does not fail the Bible fundamentally. Well, enough on supersessionism. We can talk about that more in our sessions together if you want to. I don't want to dwell on it, but I do want to point it out that this is a very distinctive characteristic of Paauw's understanding here. Now, Paauw also notes that there are four Gospels that in some ways present four Jesuses. I've elaborated on this a bit in some work that I did before I ever read Paauw, and the handout that you have includes a section, two-page section called Gospel Openings, with the openings of the four Gospels printed out. You don't know which is which. I haven't labeled them. I invite you to discover which of the four is which Gospel, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But more importantly, what I ask you to do is to read those openings and ask yourself, if this is the opening of a book, as it is, how would I describe the main character who's going to appear in this book? Don't name the character, but describe the character in light of what the gospel writer has said to introduce the whole book. And once we realize that there are four different kinds of characters here, as Paauw also seems to recognize, then why reduce it all to one Jesus? Isn't there something about the plurality of Gospels, of Jesuses in the New Testament, that could say something about the different big stories that can be told in the Bible? We'll see, and we'll talk about that more. Finally, I want to talk about covenants and the idea of this increasingly focused covenant that Paauw suggests is present within the big story of the Bible. It's a question of sequence that we have to ask when he says it's a progressive revelation and increasingly focused. Again, on the handout, I've listed the covenant language, the covenants that we encounter in the Jewish Bible, in our Old Testament. First of all, in the canonical order in which we encounter them. Noah in Genesis 9, Abram in Genesis 15, his name gets changed and it's with Abraham in Genesis 17. Then the covenant with Moses, with Israel through Moses at Sinai in Exodus 19, and also throughout the book of Deuteronomy, where Moses seems to retell the story of the encounter at Sinai with its with the lifestyle that God gave Israel as God's people. Then a covenant with David in 2 Samuel chapters 5 and 7. A new covenant announced by Isaiah in chapter 61, Jeremiah in chapter 31, and Ezekiel in chapter 16. And finally, a covenant that's curiously referred to by Jeremiah as my covenant with David and the Levites, Jeremiah 33, but then a covenant with the Levites that is referenced in Malachi 2 and Nehemiah 13. We don't have a record of that covenant with the Levites. It's simply referred to by Jeremiah, Malachi, and Nehemiah. But we have to recognize that it is named that way. And so apparently there was some understanding of a covenant with the Levites. Well, that's the way we would encounter them as we move through the Bible. But already we don't have something that simply starts out universal and narrows down to a single figure, because the covenant with Noah is universal. Then with Abram and his descendants, that narrows, okay. Then we get to Moses and Sinai, but that's still with all of the descendants of Abram, so that doesn't narrow down any further. It does narrow down to a covenant with David and his progeny as the kings of Israel, admittedly. But then the new covenant of Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel is once again with all the people. I will put my law within them. I will give them a new heart. And it's with all the people, so it's broadened out again. It isn't narrowed down. And with David and the Levites, then, it does come somewhat back more narrow, but we've contracted and expanded and contracted in a way that doesn't seem to fit what Paauw's saying in the canonical order. In the right-hand column, I've given you roughly the historical order of the writing of these. I say roughly because 5 of them are really all written during the exile, and it's hard for us to know which of those comes earlier or later within the exile. So I simply label the exilic period collectively as number 3 in that list. But that means that the first and oldest language of covenant, as characterizing the relationship between God and Israel, is the one with Moses and Sinai, which is already with the people Israel, God's people, those who have been made God's people out of the Exodus. Second would be Jeremiah's new covenant, which again is with the people. And then third, we start to see this narrowing to Abram or Abraham. That's still the people of God, construed differently, with David, which narrows it down, but also with Noah, which is the most universal covenant in the entire Bible. And then finally, in fourth position, is the covenant with David and the Levites, or the new covenant of Isaiah 61 in the post-exilic period. So whether we're reading this in the order in which we encounter them in the Bible, reading from Genesis to, are we reading the Christian Old Testament, or are we reading the Jewish Bible? In this case, it doesn't really matter all that much, but there is some slight difference with where Nehemiah is placed. In any case, whether we read it in the order in which we see it, as we encounter it reading the Bible from beginning to end, or if we understand it in terms of the sequence in which these covenants were written about and described historically, in neither case, I would suggest, does it fit Paauw's neat schematic of universal narrowing down to particular, ultimately to be universal again. So if he's going to use that as a way to structure his big story, and he's welcome to do that, but he has to tell us on what basis he's doing that, because it's not what's obvious from the story that gets told in the Bible. I really don't want to leave you with the thought that there's nothing here from Paauw that's worthwhile. I have obviously a number of points at which I think there are issues one could take with what he has said. But fundamentally, I do want to say that I think his critique thus far and his reorienting us to a story is really very good. His method is worth following, emulating. But if covenant doesn't finally end up being a clear thread that runs through the Bible, and if his reading of the way that Christianity picks up God's promises from biblical Israel is inherently supersessionist and cuts off God's relationship with the Jews, and it seems to me he has at least opened the door, if not demanded of us, a different story, a different way of applying his insights and his method to come out with a somewhat different result. We won't do that yet this week. We'll start with those alternative stories that other people have seen in the Bible, and we'll do a similar critique with them over the next several weeks. But for now, sufficient unto the chapter are the challenges thereof. And we'll have a great time discussing all of this in our sessions this week, I'm sure. I really look forward to them. I so appreciate your engagement, your interest, and your digging into this as we try to save the Bible from ourselves. Thanks much, and God bless.